we are going to overview the major anatomical structures and their functions in the respiratory system. And I have this gorgeous drawing to share with you. I'm very proud of it. So we're going to track air as it enters the body and moves through the respiratory system down into the lungs. So the first thing is, how do we get air into our body? Well, we inhale it through two different measures, either our mouth or our nose. And the first thing is that we have our nose. So we talked about in class how nose breathing is preferred to mouth breathing, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. But your nares are the external part of your nose, and we talked about how you flare your nares. And as air comes into your nose, you then have the nasal cavity. And the nasal cavity and the nasal mucosa have special modifications that assist with doing three things. And those three things are warming the air as it comes into the body, moistening the air as it comes into the body, and cleaning it. All right? Why do we want those three things to happen? We want air to be warmed because if we increase the temperature, the ability to increase the rate with which the air in a gaseous form can actually be converted into, or air can be pushed into solution into our plasma. The same thing with moistening it as well. It assists with the process of solubility with these gases. And then cleansing the air, you have hairs, so you have macroscopic hairs that you see that are collecting any sorts of larger molecules. And then you have cilia at the cellular level on the respiratory mucosa that are there catching any bad guys, essentially, so you don't inhale them or get them down into your lungs. The next thing we're going to talk about is the pharynx, and the pharynx is simply just a passage. It's part of the conducting zone that just routes air down into our system, and there are three different portions to the pharynx. There is the nasopharynx, the oral pharynx, and laryngopharynx, and the only difference between those three parts of the pharynx are where they are located. The nasopharynx is directly behind your nasal cavity. The oral pharynx is behind your mouth. And the laryngopharynx is basically you're getting to that junction between the pharynx and the larynx. And again, it's just a passageway, and it's part of the conducting zone. The conducting zone, just as a reminder, is there's a difference between the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The conducting zone is just conducting air from one place to another, versus the respiratory zone is where actual gas exchanges are occurring. Other structures that are located in the pharynx are our three sets of tonsils. We talked about the adenoids, or the pharyngeal tonsils, the palatine, and the lingual tonsils. And those are groups of immune tissue, a lymphatic tissue that are housing lymphatic cells that are catching basically any bad guys or germs that are coming into our body. And when they're effective at doing it, we have swollen lymph nodes. I'm sorry, swollen, if we say swollen glands, things like that, but we have swollen tonsils. So once air has reached the laryngopharynx, it's now coming to another section called the larynx. And the larynx is where food and air are basically directed to the paths that they need to go. The esophagus is where food needs to go, and the trachea is where the air needs to go. So with the larynx, this is where we find the opening to the trachea and the opening to the esophagus. The opening to the trachea is called the glottis, and that's that little circle that you see right there. And we talked about how on the sides of the glottis we have those vocal cords, or they're called true vocal cords, and they vibrate as air whooshes through them basically, and that's how we create speech. On top of the glottis, we have a soft connective tissue structure called the epiglottis, and when we swallow, what happens is that the epiglottis actually covers the glottis so that food goes behind the trachea down the esophagus, as opposed to down our trachea and then, causing us to choke, which would be bad. And we talked about how so we talked about how glottis is the opening to the trachea, and epiglottis, that medical term means on top of, so it makes sense. Once air goes down the right path, it goes down the trachea, and the trachea has that C-shaped cartilage that we talked about, or the cricoid cartilage. So cricoid cartilage, and it's in a C shape. And we talked about the C shape. So this is facing the anterior aspect, and then this part of the C is facing the posterior aspect of a person. And this has no cartilage because you have the esophagus that's running. You have the, trachea here and the esophagus here. It's pushing. You have food that could be pushing down as it moves down via peristalsis against the trachea. So the trachea's got that no cartilage there on the back to be able to give a little bit. But why do we need to have cartilage in the first place in this structure? It's because the surface tension of water in our body would actually cause that trachea, if it didn't have any harder cartilage structures keeping it open. The trachea would collapse with every breath that we had, and it would stick together, and it would cause, it would be really, really difficult to breathe, because not only would we have to force air into our lungs, but we would have to force enough air that could overcome the surface tension of our trachea. So what does this C-shaped cricoid cartilage do? It keeps our trachea open or patent. When we get down to the bottom of the trachea bifurcates or divides into two sections that we see here, and these are the bronchi, and specifically they are called the primary bronchi. The primary bronchi will then invaginate or go into the lungs that you see in pink, and the area of the lungs, or the section, or the anatomical structure where the bronchi go into the lungs, is called the hilum. We've talked about that. And then these primary bronchi will start dividing into secondary bronchi immediately, and then they divide even more so into tertiary bronchi. And I like to think of the respiratory system, it's almost like an upside down tree, okay? So here would be kind of the base of the tree, the trunk of the tree moving up. And as we go up this way, then it now divides into two major branches, the bronchi, that then divide more and more and more and more into secondary and tertiary bronchi. Finally, it gets to really teeny tiny branches that are getting to the point where they're one cell layer thick, called bronchioles. And then bronchioles will move into these green structures, or these grape-like clusters throughout the lungs, that are called alveoli. Up until this point, we are strictly conducting zone, and we talked about before, conducting zone is just moving air in and out of the body. No real respiration is happening. And when I say respiration, I mean no movement of air across the plasma membrane. However, when we get down to this level, this is where, this is the respiratory membrane, specifically here, okay? This is where the exchanges of carbon dioxide and oxygen can occur. We talked about these little alveoli, and we want them to be nice big grapes. We don't want them to be little shriveled raisins. And we talked about a specific type of chemical called surfactant, which is a lipid substance that is made by type 2 alveolar cells. And they actually combat the surface tension of water. So water molecules, and we're mostly water, want to bind to each other because of their slight polar charges. So water is a polar molecule. But if we look like a little grape, then the respiratory membrane is not going to come into close contact with a capillary bed, and we're not going to have sufficient exchanges. And again, our body's going to have to work on not only getting air in the body, but inflating those alveoli. So we want our alveoli to look like nice, big, fat grapes. Other structures that assist with the respiratory system are this muscle right here, the diaphragm. Okay. As it contracts, it moves inferiorly. sorry, my pen's not working well here, and causes the chest cavity to increase in volume, which means that it decreases in pressure. And as we talked about in class, when that happens, air will then naturally just want to come in to equalize it. Okay? Another set of muscles are the intercostal muscles. So they are muscles that are on our rib cage here. I want you to think about our rib cage over our ribs here. Okay? And they are also helping to expand or increase the volume in our chest cavity. If people are having trouble breathing, chronic difficulties with respiration, they'll start using muscles in their neck and in their abdomen further down to try to assist with getting air in.